Hello, everyone. Today we are talking all about just defining general angles. Specifically, today, 8.1 day one is going to really focus on working through angles measured in degrees. And you'll see 8.2, the next day is going to be all about working with the same thing, only in radians. So for angles, you can have basically those two different measurements. Kind of like for distances, you can measure things in miles and inches. When you talk about angles, you can measure them in degrees or you can measure them in something called radians. Today, we're talking about the one that you guys probably mostly have worked with, which is degrees. And most angles, there's some specific names that we look at for some of the different sides. So, when we talk about measuring angles or an angle in what's called standard position, is when one of the sides of the angle, which we call the initial side, is on the positive side of the x-axis. So that's always one of the sides of the angle. And the other is obviously the one that is going to float and move around the the coordinate grid with the vertex centered at the origin. And that side is called the terminal side. So the terminal side is always the one that's going to be rotating around the vertex. So when we look for our angles, and we're going to draw, today we're just going to draw some basic pictures of them. And it's important to notice that these numbers are here. Every time you work your way a quarter of the way around the circle, that is always going to be 90 degrees. So as you work your way up, so as I get to this point in my angle, that's 90 degrees. This part of my angle would be 180. This one would be 90 degrees more, which is 270. And obviously one more quarter turn would get you to 360. And the cool part is you could keep going. If I could, when angles go, you could go around this circle as many times as we want. And we just keep adding 90 degrees. So 360 plus 90 would give us our answer for the next part. But if we keep going around, you could keep adding 90 degrees to each of these pieces, and you can kind of see where that's going to take you. So 360 plus 90, that would put my next one at what? 450. If I keep going 450 plus 90, that's going to put me at 540. And we could keep doing this forever. So typically what we're going to do though, how it's going to look is I'm just going to say draw an angle with a given certain measurement. So for each of those measurements, you're going to notice that there's the first thing that we are going to do is just do kind of a quick sketch. Now, before we get into the major concepts of the grid, it might be helpful to just remember a couple of different things about our grid. And that is that we have technically 4 different quadrants. The first one that we have is in the upper right, that's quadrant 1. Quadrant 2 is going to be kind of going counterclockwise, would be to the upper left. Then quadrant 3 would be down below that. And quadrant 4 would finish off being below quadrant 1. And this would be quadrant 4. So those are 4 different quadrants. And these are going to be where we talk about where the final angle is going to end up. So if we look at 220 degrees, it's important to note, obviously, that the terminal side is definitely going to be marked at the origin along the positive x-axis line. And the terminal side is going to go around the circle until it reaches about 220 degrees. So obviously, if I only go to here, that would be 90. Ooh, nope. If I only go kind of around here, that would be 90. If I keep going, this would be 180. So that would put me around like about here. And 220, the next cutoff here would be 270 degrees, but that's a little too far. 220 is about 40 degrees more than 180. So my final 220 degree angle would be right here. Now, like I said, you could potentially keep going more. So if I take my next one, obviously 520, this one is just going around the circle more than once. Because 520, oops, I'll do this in green just because it makes it a little easier to see. So if I put obviously the initial side where it's supposed to at 0 degrees, if I keep going, we get 90, 180, 270, 360 would put me all the way back around. So one way you could kind of figure out where this is going to be is you could potentially keep adding 90 degrees to see where you're at. Some students like to go the route where if you subtract 360, you'll be able to see approximately where the final angle should fall. So 520 or 520 minus 360 is going to end up being 160 degrees. And that tells me approximately where it's going to be. 90 obviously would be here, 180 would be here. So if I keep going, it's more than 90 and it's obviously less than 180. So my final angle here, my terminal side would end up being here. And that would be a 520 degree angle. Now you can also go negative. So if you look, I do have some negative examples on here. So like negative 60, again, we would still look at our general picture and we still measure from 0 degrees. But as you can imagine, if positive angles work their way counterclockwise, negative angles work their way clockwise. So if I go down a quarter turn, that would be negative 90. And negative 60 isn't quite at negative 90. So this angle right here would be approximately negative 60 degrees. Okay. Now, all of these, because angles can keep going around the circle, and usually we'll call this the unit circle. You'll see kind of why a little bit later in the unit. But because angles can basically keep going around the circle, we have what's called something, or we have something that's called a coterminal angle or coterminal angles. Usually it's plural because these are all the angles that have the same terminal side. So they're angles where if you were to work your way all the way around the unit circle, it's an angle that would fall in the terminal side would fall in the same location, even though it would be a larger or smaller angle. And a lot of times how we just go about finding those is we use the fact that to get all the way around, it's 360 degrees. So a really common method is if you take whatever angle it is and add 360, you found an angle that's greater than it that would fall in the same location. But if you subtract 360 degrees, so if I take 60 minus 360, that's where you can get any negative angles. And really, you could keep adding 360 or keep subtracting 360, and every single one of those angles would be something that would be considered coterminal. So typically because there's so many answers to this, you're going to see in the directions that it says find one positive and one negative. And really that just means we're either going to keep adding 360 until we find a positive answer, or we're going to keep subtracting 360 until we get a negative answer. Now, because our angle on this first example is negative 45, I really only have to do this once. If I take negative 45 plus 360, we're going to get 315 degrees. So there's our first positive answer. And then if I take negative 45 minus 360 degrees, that's going to leave us with negative 405 degrees. And there is a negative answer. Now, could you keep going? Sure. If you keep subtracting 360, you could keep getting more angles. Same thing with adding 360, both will work. Now, sometimes you might need to get to a positive and negative, you might need to go more than one. So like for mine, for 395, if I subtract 360, that doesn't get me all the way. That gets me to only 35 degrees. So is that a bad answer for a positive coterminal angle? No, technically you've already found one. But the idea is that I still want a negative one, which means I still have to keep going then. I'm going to subtract another 360, another rotation around the circle. And that's going to leave me with my final answer of negative 325 degrees. And there is a negative one. So this is going to be what you're working on for today. All right. So you guys can go ahead and you guys can start the homework for the day.